G'day history lovers, it's me, Random History, and today we're going to be discussing the rise and fall of the Kingdom of Kent. Kent, which if you are unaware, is a large county in southeastern England which is home to a population of 1.8 million people today. It was once one of the, if not the most powerful kingdom in Anglo-Saxon England before fate would prove its undoing. I personally have a lot of ancestors from Kent, which is actually what inspired me to make this video. So with all that being said, let's get into the rise and downfall. Our story of the Kingdom of Kent starts with the Judes. For those of you who are unaware who the Judes were, they were one of the three main Germanic tribes that made up the Anglo-Saxons. Funnily enough, they aren't actually acknowledged in any way in the name Anglo-Saxon, like the Angles and the Saxons are, but they were nonetheless one of the main tribes responsible in the forming of Anglo-Saxon England. Now that we actually know who they were, how about let's just dive right into how they actually got to England from Denmark to begin with. According to the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, a king of the Britons known as Vortigern invited two Germanic brothers, Hengist and Horsa, to Britain to help defend against Pictish raiders. This, however, would come to bite Vortigern in the arse, as after defeating the Pictish raiders, Hengist and Horsa turned on the British and invited more Germanic tribes to help them conquer Britain, including the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. It is said that in 455, Hengist and Horsa fought Vortigern at Aeglesthorpe, which is probably modern-day Aylesford in Kent. In the battle, Horsa was killed, after which Hengist would succeed him as King of Kent, who was then followed in turn by his son Ace. It is worth noting that Hengist is listed as the first Jutish King of Kent, so I'm sort of going to assume that Hengist and Horsa were both Jutes. In 456, Hengist and his son Aesk battled the Britons at Craigenford, probably Crayford, after which the defeated Britons fled Kent for their London stronghold. After the Briton threat was gone, large numbers of Jutes began to settle in Kent and likely intermixed with the Britons who still remained. Now firmly its own kingdom, in the 6th century the Kingdom of Kent had quite a strong relationship with the Kingdom of Francia, which was at that point extending its influence into northwestern Europe. Some sources suggest that Kent may have actually been a part of Francia for a bit of the 6th century. Kent at this time had a huge trading business, trading with peoples as far away as the Rhineland and southern Scandinavia. Interestingly, archaeological evidence suggests this trading was specific to certain people groups rather than certain geographic areas, so they might have skipped one people group closer to them to trade with another one a bit further away, for example. Also, at some point during this century, East Kent annexed what had previously been a separate principality, West Kent. In 568, the King of Kent was defeated in battle by Ceawlin of the West Saxon at Wimbledon, marking the first conflict between the Germanic tribes of England, as all conflicts up to that point had been between the Germanic invaders and the original Britons. Also, just a side note, if anyone knows how to pronounce these Anglo-Saxon names properly, or like if I'm pronouncing them wrong, please let me know in the comments, because there are a lot of names in here and I'm 90% sure I've got at least some of them wrong, so if you do know, please let me know. The actual location of the Wimbledon battle though has not been confirmed, although it does seem likely it took place near the boundary between Hampshire and Berkshire, which was probably disputed territory between Kent and West Saxon at the time. It seems the reason for the conflict was that Ceawlin was looking to secure his rear before mounting renewed attacks against the Britons to the west. In 591 or 592, Ceawlin of the West Saxon was usurped by his nephew Ceawl, which granted the title of Bretwalda to Aethelbert, the King of Kent at the time. For those of you who didn't know, the title of Bretwalda was usually given to the king whose kingdom was the strongest, so that suggests that the Kingdom of Kent was the strongest kingdom in all of England at this time. In the year 597, the Christianization of England began in Kent under our good friend Aethelbert's reign, when the Benedictine monk Augustine arrived on the Ebbsfleet Peninsula with the intentions of converting England to Christianity and to turn them away from their old Germanic religion. It is said that Aethelbert was surprisingly extremely hospitable towards this foreign monk. It's worth noting that Aethelbert's Frankish wife Bertha was already a Christian, and Aethelbert himself would convert a few years after the arrival of Augustine, marking the first Christian king in England. The monk Beda refers to Kent as ruled by Aethelbert at this period, which also makes him the earliest reliably attested Anglo-Saxon monarch. Beda states that Aethelbert was a Bretwalda who controlled everything south of the River Humber, including other kingdoms during this period. Unfortunately, this was the peak of Kent's power, and the kingdom would experience a gradual decrease over the next 2 centuries. So, let's get into that. In the 7th century, Kent's power began to wane for the first time as the kingdoms of Mercia and Northumbria grew in strength. The situation was not helped by the state of the royal family at the time, which was tumultuous, to say the least. In 664, the King of Kent, Ueckenbert, would die from an epidemic that was sweeping the country at the time when he was only in his 40s. The king's early death would spark a succession crisis, with the ascension of the king's son, Egbert, being challenged by the heirs of Ermenred, the recently deceased king's late brother. Egbert would end up murdering his cousins Aethelred and Aethelbert at the royal villa soon after. Ecgbert would rule for the next 9 years until his passing. He would be succeeded by his brother, Hlothere, who ruled from 674 to 686 before being overthrown and killed by one of Ecgbert's sons, Adric, who had aligned himself with the South Saxons. Adric would also only rule for a year, however, and in the late 7th century, probably due to all this, Kent gradually came to be dominated by Mercia. You see, there had been a Kentish royal hall and reeve in Londonwick until at least the 680s before it passed on to the Mercians. The loss of Londonwick most likely broke Kent's monopoly on cross-channel trade and its control of its thames, weakening the kingdom even further. In 686, Kent was conquered by Caedwalla of Wessex, which is why Adric would only rule for a year. After the successful conquest, Caedwalla would place his brother Mull on the throne of Kent, but he was killed within a year in a Kentish revolt, after which Caedwalla would return to devastate the kingdom once more in retaliation for his brother's death. After this, Kent understandably fell into a state of disarray. The Mercians backed a client king named Oswine, but he seems to have only reigned for about 2 years and was succeeded by Witred. Witred is famous for the law of Witred, which was a legal text devoted to the defence of the church. Witred also did a good job of rebuilding the kingdom after years of turmoil, and in 694 he managed to make peace with the West Saxons, or Wessex, by paying compensation for the killing of Mull. The kingdom seems to have been relatively stable until the death of Witred in 725, but unfortunately, records after his death are often fragmented and obscure. What we do know, though, is that for the next 40 years it was typical for 2 or even 3 kings to be ruling simultaneously in Kent, and that this internal division may have made Kent the first target of the rising power of Offa of Mercia. In 764, Offa gained supremacy over Kent and ruled it through client kings, but by the early 770s it appears Offa was attempting to rule Kent directly as a part of Mercia. Due to this, there was a rebellion in Kent and a battle was fought at Otford in 776. Although the exact outcome of the battle is unknown, records of the following years suggest that the rebels prevailed as Ealhmund, and later his son Ecgbert II, seemed to have ruled independently of Offa for nearly a decade afterwards. Unfortunately, Kent's newly found freedom wouldn't last for long, as Offa firmly re-established his authority over Kent in 785. There was a Kennish Rebellion after Offa died in 796, however it was short-lived, and Offa's successor, Cohen Wulf, would reconquer Kent 2 years later and place his brother, Cuthred, as king, after whom's death in 807, Cohen Wulf ruled Kent directly. In 825, Mercian authority was replaced by that of Wessex following the latter's victory at the Battle of Ellendon. But with all that, the self-governing Kingdom of Kent, a once proud and prosperous kingdom, was gone forever. So that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did enjoy this video, make sure to like and subscribe as always. And feel free to give me some constructive criticism in the comments, as well as any suggestions for future videos you'd like to see. But yeah guys, with all that being said, if you're still here, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.